Hi, welcome to the Small Festival Book Club and the first of two films on Rutger Bregman's HumanKind. In this first film, I'll set out what I think to be the purpose of this book, which is to say what its argument is, and in the second, I'll critique it and suggest an alternative to his main argument and conclusion. So then, HumanKind, part academic argument, part polemic, is a sprawling trove of stories, arguments and scientific studies, all devoted to the radical idea that deep down we are fundamentally decent, and the equally radical idea that if we really believed this, as we should, our world would be transformed. So this is writing with purpose, and it's a purpose I think with two intentions. Firstly, to debunk the many myths which present humanity as depraved and sinful, and secondly, to provide an array of real-life examples of human kindness and self-organisation, which Bregman presents as islands of alternative realities, each reflecting what all of us could be if we could only free ourselves from the mental slavery that keeps us enthralled to a cynical view of human nature. Change this, Bregman tells us, and all else can follow. So I'm going to consider these two aspects of the book, debunking the myths and setting out an alternative set of realities, in three parts. In the first, I'll look at the breadth and scale of these myths in what Bregman calls veneer theory. In the second, I'll look to see how he seeks to deconstruct these, that is to say, how he tries to take down the many-headed hydra of veneer theory. And in the third section, we'll look at some real-life examples of kindness and self-organisation which Bregman presents as models for a different way of living. So, beginning with part one and taking the first of these, the breadth and scale of these myths, here Bregman presents every story, every argument, every recommendation and every scientific conclusion that presents human beings as selfish, vindictive and violent. All of these are expressions of what he calls veneer theory, which is a catch-all classification originally coined by a Dutch biologist for the many and varied arguments for our sinful and stunted nature. In imagery, this is the all-pervasive idea that civilization is a thin veneer, superficial and easily broken, revealing underneath our true, seething, sinful, sadistic and Hobbesian nature, after the 17th century philosopher who advised that we seek power after power that only ceaseth in death. And unless we have an all-powerful Leviathan, that is to say, an all-powerful state, there to protect us from ourselves, life would be poor, nasty, solitary, brutish and short. So this is an all-pervading ideology, working to stunt our moral and creative possibilities, defining our nature as ugly and selfish in 1,000 different ways. It's in the religious conviction of original sin. It's in the science of Darwin and Dawkins, natural selection and the selfish gene. It's in the political philosophy of Machiavelli, Hobbes and Nietzsche. It's in Homo economicus, the model of self-seeking man at the heart of orthodox economics. It echoes throughout our culture in The Lord of the Flies and The Planet of the Apes. It's been supported by a series of outrageous psychological experiments in the 1960s, widely known and widely believed, and the whole construction is wheeled out with every crisis, such as Hurricane Katrina, and daily perpetuated by the news, our very own crack cocaine, equally addictive as it is bad, leading to what some psychologists call mean world syndrome. Now for Bregman, this multi-layered chorus of human imperfection is a good example of a nocebo, which is best understood as an inversion of the better-known idea of placebo, which itself is understood as a benign belief that something good becomes real by our believing it. Well, a nocebo is the opposite. It's a malign belief that something bad becomes real by are believing in it. And here Bregman tells us, following Socrates and the Buddha, we are what we think. And because of this, veneer theory is a nocebo of exceptional power, locking us into a world premised on cruelty and selfishness, and which seems to be confirmed by every global poll, with people repeatedly emphasizing growing distrust and a sense of moral decline. So that's the end of part 1, the breadth and scale of veneer theory. Now let's turn to part 2, taking down the hydra of this veneer theory. And here Bregman makes it his mission to deconstruct these multiple claims to human imperfection, so that the first part of the book might be seen as a kind of personal odyssey, taking on those who would make monsters of us. Beginning with The Lord of the Flies, a story of shipwrecked boys and their descent into savagery and death, which for Bregman is far more than just a novel, but the veritable textbook for veneer theory, and which, he argues, contrasts with the real Lord of the Flies, when in 1966 6 boys were shipwrecked on an island for 15 months in a true story of harmony, flourishing, friendship and loyalty. Then he updates us on evolutionary theory, arguing that friendliness rather than struggle is the engine of evolution, emphasizing, and here he's walking in the footsteps of Noah Harari, that it is social intelligence, sociability and friendliness which is our true superpower. It's what gave us the edge as a species and has led to the evolutionary softening of our features, so that we've evolved to become a softer, younger and more open species, which is why he calls us Homo puppy, who from here on becomes the symbolic representative of our true nature. And this is a nature evolved for friendliness and opposed to violence, well, at least against our own. And in one of the many component parts he claims to be the science behind his argument, he details numerous findings to show our deep and persistent resistance to killing. Following the historian Colonel Marshall, he tells us quite amazingly that most soldiers across the whole of history never fired their guns. Added to this, Bregman tells us that scientists say there is no convincing evidence for prehistoric warfare, which means that we spent 200,000 years and 95% of our existence as peaceful hunter-gatherers in what Rousseau would call the youth of our species, so that the Hobbesian war of all against all was just a figment of his imagination. These then are the findings and the conclusion he considers to be the science, validating his call for a new realism about our essential nature, a nature symbolized by the image of Homo puppy as an intuitively life-affirming being, hardwired for connection and instinctively opposed to violence. But if Homo puppy represents our past and potential future, veneer theory in all of its forms stands as an obstacle to this future, which of course is why Bregman goes after all those toxic mythmakers and peddlers of veneer theory, especially the psychologists who gave such scientific legitimacy to a demeaning framing of our nature. Thus, confident that the science is behind him, Bregman critiques a whole series of thinkers and experiments, beginning with Jared Diamond's classic account of how society on Easter Island collapsed, presented by Diamond as a story of violence and destruction, but which Bregman deconstructs, providing an alternative explanation and a different, more positive framing of the island and its people. More dramatically, he critiqued the world-famous Milgrim shock machine experiment, and there he is, this hapless participant who, despite his protestations, keeps clicking the switch over and over again. Equally, he criticises what he takes to be the similarly flawed Stanford prison experiment, where psychology students internalised roles, becoming either vindictive guards or scared inmates, in an experiment dramatically ended as it seemed to be spiralling out of control. But again, Bregman marshals his evidence to argue that both these world-influencing experiments, the Milgrim and the Stanford, were not founded in science, but were a kind of manufactured theatre driven by the vanity and self-interest of its lead authors. In the same way, he deconstructs and refutes the urban myth surrounding the death of Susan Genovese, which claimed that 38 respectable citizens watched as she was stabbed to death in 3 separate attacks. A myth which, like the Milgrim and Stanford experiments, took hold of the popular imagination, and from which came another psychological theory, the so-called bystander effect, one more grim indictment on our nature, summed up in the phrase, "I don't want to get involved." Again, like Milgrim and Stanford, this is shown to be another example of self-interested myth-making, with the news organisations ever willing to manufacture corrosive but profitable cynicism. So that concludes the first half of the book devoted to the debunking of the myths. Now let's turn to the second half in section 3, where Bregman provides real-life examples of human kindness and self-organisation as models for a different way of living. So he finds this in the leadership of Joss du Bloc's award-winning company built on self-managing teams. It's in Carl Theodor Sorenson's Junk Playground, the Agora and Summerhill schools with no classes, no classrooms, no grades, no homework and no hierarchy. It's in the open prisons of Norway, premised on trust and possibility rather than on punishment. It's in Mandela's masterclass in seeing the best in people and harnessing them to a bigger possibility. And it's in the 100 experiments of participatory democracy across the world, and in the empirically evidenced power and success of non-violent campaigns for change. All of which embody the spirit of anarchism, which is the foundation and energy of this book. This is a philosophy deeply cynical about entrenched power, but equally believing in the creative possibilities of human beings, who sees the birth of the state as the birth of human enslavement and a catastrophe for our species. And it is with this anarchist lens and confidence and optimism that Bregman offers us a vision of what might be possible were we to shun the mythologies of veneer theory. When we can trust in others, and when leaders like Mandela can see only the good in people, and when 100,000 soldiers on Christmas Eve during the First World War laid down their arms to overcome not only fear, ignorance and superstition, but the hierarchy of 2 imperial armies. And with that inspirational image of moral courage, he tells us, among other things, to assume the best in people, think in win-win scenarios, don't be ashamed to do good, and be realistic. So be realistic. Be courageous, be true to your nature and offer your trust. Do good in broad daylight and don't be ashamed of your generosity. You may be dismissed as gullible and naive at first, but remember, what is naive today may be common sense tomorrow. It's time for a new realism. It's time for a new view of humankind. So that's the end of that, and in the next film I will offer a critique.